Mosaic is brought to you by these generous sponsors and underwriters. Learn how you can support Mosaic by visiting jewishpalmbeach.org. Good morning, I'm Barbara Kay, here with Susan Pertnoy, and welcome to all of you to Mosaic, Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County's weekly news magazine show. Mosaic explores Jewish topics here in the Palm Beaches and around the world.
Few journalists have had a career like Pulitzer Prize-Winning columnist Bret Stephens. After bursting onto the scene with the Wall Street Journal, Bret took the helm of the Jerusalem Post. Today, he has a prominent political column with the New York Times.
This morning, we'll sit down with Bret Stephens for an in-depth discussion about his career, as well as his unique take on how today's political landscape is impacting Israel and the Jewish community.
We'll be right back with our interview with Bret right after this break.
Please consider supporting Mosaic's generous sponsors at Bruce Gendelman Insurance Services. Visit gendelman.com today for your expert consultation.
Live the way you want to live, in the luxury you deserve. At Morse Life's Tradition, choose a floor plan that suits your lifestyle and make it your own. Impeccable service and the gold standard in specialized signature healthcare. Live healthy. Live happy. At Tradition is where the living is easy, every day and in every way. Your home. Morse Life. Tradition.
Interested in a different kind of Israel travel experience? Join dozens of local community members for a personalized journey through Israel during the country's 70th year of independence. Israel Your Way is Jewish Federation Community Mission to Israel in June 2018. 5 immersive tracks will explore Israel's technology and innovation, arts and culture and cuisine, spirituality and religion, politics and security, and even a track for first-timers and families. Learn more and sign up while there's still space at israelyourway.org. We're here with Bret Stephens, who, I have to read this because I want to get it right, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. In 2013, you won it for commentary. You are presently the op-ed columnist for the New York Times. You are the author of America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. And you're the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and former deputy editor of the Wall Street Journal. Wow, what an illustrious career, and welcome to Mosaic.
Thank you.
It's such a thrill to have you with us. Can you tell us about your background and what motivated you to become a journalist?
Good question. I grew up in Mexico City, of all places. That's where my childhood was spent. And went to a boarding school in Massachusetts where I started a rabble-rousing student newspaper. And the electricity of being able to write, think, and spark discussions was intoxicating. So the taste, I'm mixing metaphors now, but the taste never left my mouth since then.
Now, did you grow up in a religious home? Is that why you have such a proclivity for being so pro-Israel?
No, on the contrary. I often joke that I grew up in a home that was as minimally Jewish as you can get, short of being Unitarian. But there was a strong Jewish sense in our family. My mother had been born in Nazi-occupied Europe and came to America as a young child as a displaced person. My paternal grandfather had come to America a generation or two earlier following the pogrom in Kishinev in 1903, and I had family in Israel. So I first visited Israel when I was 9 years old, and the country made an early impression on me.
How did you become editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post at age 28?
Bribes.
Bribed? Can you tell us a story?
That's a joke. I had been working for the Wall Street Journal based in Brussels. And from Brussels, more or less on a fluke, I started doing a lot of reporting out of the Middle East. This is around the year 2000, just following the failure of the Camp David summit. And an editor of mine, my editor was then in New York, suggested that I go out to Israel and the Palestinian Authority and do a story on the kind of state Palestine would be if Arafat had declared a state, as he was then threatening to do on the 7th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. So my first trip to the region as a journalist was spent mainly in Ramallah and Gaza, Jenin, Nablus, and so on, really trying to report the story from inside Palestinian communities rather than as an Israeli-Palestinian story.
Were you fearful of anything?
Not particularly. That was just before the beginning of the Second Intifada. Then I kind of got the bug and started going out with greater frequency, even as the danger of visiting some of these places grew.
Yeah, can you elaborate on what it was like to be over there during the Second Intifada?
Well, there were a great many bombings. I think I once counted 85 suicide bombings during my time as editor of the Jerusalem Post. My wife and I both had a couple of close calls. My wife was supposed to be at Cafe Moment the night it was bombed, and just by a fluke, a friend of hers who had invited her called it off, and that's why she wasn't there. There was a bombing on Rehov Aza, just down the street from where I lived, that I remember very vividly. I think I was maybe the first or one of the first people on the scene. So it was very vivid, in some respects terrifying, but in other respects inspiring period of time, because one thing that you learned about Israel, even during that period, was that it was a society with a great sense of resilience. It was a society that kept picking itself up, kept reopening the cafes that had been bombed.
It's amazing.
That was determined to go on living amid the dying.
Did you have any stigma because you were in a Sabra as an editor-in-chief when you were there?
Yes, I did. I think I was an outsider. I felt that keenly, not just being an outsider, but being a 28-year-old with people reporting to me who were often more than twice my age. What I tried to do is just be competent, professional, friendly, straightforward. I had a very clear vision of what I wanted to do with the paper, and we went about trying to meet that vision, and I think we did it with some success. The Jerusalem Post, as a paper that had started in the 1930s, had for many years seen itself as the kind of New York Times of Israel, a general interest newspaper. But by the time I got there, most Israelis were native Hebrew speakers. They weren't native English or German or other language speakers. And I really thought of the paper as a bridge to the diaspora, and a bridge that should focus on issues that really concern the diaspora, like security, diplomacy, regional affairs, terrorism. I didn't feel an urge to cover every municipal election, and I think we were able to husband our resources more effectively.
Well, it makes so much sense. That way they feel the connection to want to be a part of Israel and understand why it's so important to have it exist.
Well, they were also our core audience, because an English language newspaper has millions of readers abroad, but a relatively small audience in Israel, not insignificant, but smaller. And when I was there, it was also a period when tourism the well had dried, so it was an interesting challenge.
One last question about this topic. What do you see as a difference between journalism in Israel versus journalism in the United States?
Oh, I mean, look, they're somewhat incomparable in that the nature of journalism, journalism in Israel tends to be much more personalized. You follow a journalist rather as much as you do a publication. There were journalists, for instance, in Haaretz, for whom I had great respect. Others I thought were highly political and polemical. Journalism in Israel tends to be much more opinionated and often more speculative, you might say, in that I would sometimes find myself reading stories and think, well, that might be true, but I'm not sure it is true. That's not to say it didn't have great strengths and great virtues, and you could really find out interesting things that you didn't find in the United States. The U.S., of course, American journalism worships at the god of objectivity, which is an imperfect god. And American journalists go about their business a little differently. But it's two different cultures will obviously have two different forms of journalism, and I think both of them have their strengths.
Thank you. We're going to switch topics, but before we do that, we have to stop for a commercial break. We'll be right back with Bret Stephens after this brief message.
Please consider supporting Mosaic sponsors at Lesser, Landy & Smith. Visit lesserlawfirm.com to learn more.
Honor the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. this year by creating a positive impact in your community with the Jewish Volunteer Center. On January 15th, you can join together with hundreds of people to lead high-impact volunteer projects around the Palm Beaches during the Jewish Volunteer Center's MLK Day of Service. You can see a full list of volunteer opportunities by visiting jewishpalmbeach.org/MLK. We're back with Bret Stephens, and I'd like to talk to you about global anti-Semitism. You've written extensively about it. Can you tell me about your feelings on what's going on in the world?
Look, anti-Semitism is a 19th century term for Jew hatred, and it's a shape-shifting virus, which is to say that hatred of Jews, which was for many centuries a religiously based phenomenon, was in the 19th century a racially based phenomenon. And I think the late 20th, early 21st century variation of anti-Semitism is in fact anti-Zionism. It's a national based worldview. But it uses the same tropes. It's susceptible to the same kinds of conspiracy thinking, the same kind of mendacity. It often has the same genocidal aims, and of course the target is more or less the same. So I think we have to be aware of the historical context so that we understand that some forms of anti-Semitism may seem antiquated because, of course, people today don't usually treat Jews as a racial category. But many of those same hatreds that we know from the 30s and 40s have mutated and been given a new political package. I see anti-Semitism as a phenomenon that concerns me because it's coming from both the right and the left. There's an old-fashioned right-wing anti-Semitism based in populist, xenophobic politics that is resurging throughout the world. It's I think shocking. It should continue to shock us that the National Front in France made it once again to the second round of the elections. I think there are strains of anti-Semitism that, of course, you saw in Charlottesville, but that are also resurging on the alt-right web and in those circles here in the United States. And there's a left-wing anti-Semitism typified by the BDS movement on college campuses, which seeks to delegitimize and demonize just one state in the world. I don't see a BDS movement occurring when it comes to China because China's occupying Tibet, or when it comes to India because India is arguably occupying parts of Kashmir, or any number of other countries. It just applies by some strange coincidence to the Jewish state. So I think it's important for everyone, but most of all for Jews, to understand that there are enemies both to the right and to the left, and that we have to be cognizant that while these hatreds come from different sides of the political aisle, they target us all the same.
You know, you mentioned college campuses. It's very frightening right now to know that students are really being, instead of being open-minded, they are really fractionalized by these different views. And BDS is so powerful, and it's incredible in 2017 that this is actually occurring.
Well, I think there are a great many students on campuses that are being hoodwinked into believing that BDS is a movement for justice. I think many students who join BDS campaigns do so not out of hatred, but out of naivete, because they don't really have, frankly, much of a command of the facts, and they're easily misled by propaganda. But it's worth saying to these students that the one state in the Middle East that respects all the rights that you care about, whether it's women's rights, gay rights, the rights of the accused, minority rights, just go down the list, concerns about the environment and so on. The one state in the Middle East that respects those rights and has since the day of its founding is the very state you're demonizing. So I can understand why you might be in favor of BDS if you are a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and you just, from a theological point of view, consider Israel to be an illegitimate state. But to be in favor of the delegitimization of Israel from the point of view of a liberal or a progressive is illogical. And I think that's a point that those of us who oppose BDS need to drive home relentlessly. You cannot be a liberal, you cannot be a progressive, and oppose the one liberal and progressive state in that region.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of that region, let's move to Israel. What do you think about this administration's announcement that they are contemplating moving, or they will move, the embassy to Jerusalem?
Well, I supported it, and I wrote as much in a column just the other day in the New York Times. First of all, I don't think that moving the embassy prejudges the final outcome of negotiations. Secondly, it's important to align America's word with its deed, and we have had a law on the books in this country for 22 years that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and I think it was correct that the administration finally decided to honor American law. And thirdly, it aligns America's word and its deed with reality. We all know Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. When Richard Nixon paid the first visit by an American president to Israel, he had his state dinner in Jerusalem. When Anwar Sadat went to Israel to make peace with the Jewish state, he went to Jerusalem. When President Obama paid his visit in 2013 to Israel, most of his time was spent in Jerusalem. So I don't think we're ever well served by maintaining obvious fictions as totems in American foreign policy. Lastly, I think it is important to tell the Palestinians that the train is leaving the station and that they cannot simply pursue a diplomacy of obstruction and maximalist demands and think that they're going to make any progress that way.
Well, to be able to keep strong-arming, it should be just a ridiculous way to behave. How does this move affect the politics in the Middle East?
Look, it's important that the end goal should be a two-state solution. It makes sense for both Israelis to maintain Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state, and it makes sense for Palestinians who've made it abundantly clear they don't want to be ruled by Israel. But it matters very much what kind of state of Palestine winds up being. Is it going to be a state like Costa Rica, which is small but peaceful and progressive and democratic and demilitarized? Or is it going to be a state like Yemen, an incubator and an exporter of violence and human tragedies? So that's not a minor question. That's in fact the central question. And instead of simply saying we need to work for a Palestinian state, the question should be, what kind of Palestinian state should we be working for, and are we in fact doing what needs to be done to make sure it is that kind of state?
You're right, and we need to continue this topic because you have to change the culture, but we'll discuss that in a moment. We need to take our final break, and we'll be back with Bret Stephens after this brief message.
Please consider supporting Mosaic's generous sponsors at Bruce Gendelman Insurance Services. Visit gendelman.com today for your expert consultation.
Live the way you want to live in the luxury you deserve. At Morse Life's Tradition, choose a floor plan that suits your lifestyle and make it your own. Impeccable service and the gold standard in specialized signature healthcare. Live healthy. Live happy. At Tradition is where the living is easy, every day and in every way. Your home. Morse Life. Tradition.
Please consider supporting Mosaic sponsors at Lesser Landy & Smith. Visit lesserlawfirm.com to learn more.
We're back with Bret Stephens, and we're talking about the Palestinian and the two-state solution. But I want to ask you, how do you change, or how do you think one would go about changing the culture of the Palestinians? They hate the Jews. They teach hatred in their books in school.
Well, let's be careful about the word they.
Oh, I shouldn't say they.
There are lots of Palestinians who have worked hand in hand with Israelis for a very long time. What you're really speaking about is Palestinian leadership, and I think that's where the gravamen of the issue lies. Look, we know in living history that cultures can change and change radically. I was in Japan earlier this year, and the Japanese culture from the first half of the 20th century into the second half was utterly transformed from a very militaristic society into a highly pacifist society. One can say the same thing about Germany, but that only happens when you start insisting that the substance of the culture, what it is you're teaching children, are you teaching a curriculum of tolerance and liberalism and pluralism and neighborliness, or is it a curriculum of hatred and envy? Those are really the substantive questions that affect the nature of societies. I mean, if you go back 30, 40 years, Palestinian society 40 years ago, many discontents, but it wasn't nearly as radicalized as it is today, because Hamas wasn't the influence then that it has become now, because you didn't have a kleptocracy in the form of Mahmoud Abbas and his government ruling over Palestinians. Cultures can change, and I think it's important to believe that, because otherwise you're stuck in a kind of determinism that leads to bigotry. The one thing we should not do is subject Palestinians to, to coin a phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations. You see hugely talented Palestinians not only in the area but throughout the world, in Texas and elsewhere, where they're very successful, forward-looking, they've integrated into American society. There is nothing genetic or biological in Palestinian society that militates that they should be permanently hostile to Israel. I think the Arab world will be well served, and this is becoming truer now than it was before, when it realizes that Israel is an asset against forces like Iran, forces like ISIS, and also a role model when it comes to educating their people, creating a technological advanced society, providing human rights for everyone, and also a level of material prosperity that it's a part of the modern world. And I think that's what the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia ultimately wants. I think that's what the President of Egypt ultimately wants. And they're now looking at Israel with a fresh eye. And I hope that that vision can be sustained over the next decades.
So how is our government dealing with this?
Well, look, I've supported the Trump administration when I agree with it, as I did over the Jerusalem issue, and I have been vocally opposed to it when I don't. For instance, I think we have badly bungled policy in Syria as to allow a butcher like Bashar Assad to remain in power. I don't yet see us having a coherent policy for dealing with the expansion of Iranian power throughout the region. We don't talk nearly as much as we should about human rights issues, not least human rights issues in places like Iran. So I think it's important to recall that this administration is not even a year old yet.
That's true.
And these things develop. But as a columnist, I try to call them as I see them. And I have been critical in many instances, but whenever I've thought praise was due, I've offered it.
Well, it's a very, very tenuous situation. I mean, you have 3 weeks ago, you had 300 worshipers killed in Sinai. There's chaos looming all over the region. It's very difficult to deal with people with such a different mentality. You need to have some sort of moderates assisting in the situation.
Look, I think there is a silent moderate majority throughout the Middle East. I've traveled extensively in dusty corners of Egypt and Sinai and Lebanon and elsewhere in the region. And the problem is that because there is no, I don't want to say democracy, but there aren't representative mechanisms, those voices are often drowned out. I think W.H. Auden said it's only the man behind the gun who has free speech. So how do you allow a more moderate center to find its voice through the region? And I think that's you're seeing signs of it. Saudi Arabia is changing. People are looking at societies like Abu Dhabi and Dubai, which for all of their problems are emblems of progress and possibility in the region. President Sisi of Egypt is on many respects a repressive ruler, but on the other hand, he does understand the danger posed by Islamism to basic Egyptian civil liberties and security and rights. So there are stirrings of this. And the United States has in the past worked in very different corners of the world, from South Korea to the Philippines to Europe, to try to give voice to those people who are looking for a future that's a little more free, a little more prosperous, a little more progressive. How do we bend those countries in that way? Not through revolutionary change, not through diktats, but through the slow, quiet, patient pressure. And that would be, I think, a wise course for any administration, Republican or Democratic, to pursue throughout the Middle East. The Middle East has millions of talented individuals who want better futures for themselves and their families. And to the extent that the United States can nudge those societies in the right direction, that's what we ought to be doing.
You're absolutely right, and thank you so much for your words of wisdom and all of your insights, and I appreciate your joining us on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mosaic is brought to you by these generous sponsors and underwriters. Learn how you can support Mosaic by visiting jewishpalmbeach.org.